The Hebrew Bible, prophecy, and DMT will be the topic of this video, and we're going to be looking at a presentation from Dr. Rick Strassman. Rick Strassman, he was a scientist who was the only one to conduct research on intravenous DMT, dimethyltryptamine, which is a powerful psychedelic that kind of brings people into intense spaces where they encounter beings in a lot of different colors and light. And Rick Strassman was approved by the government to do a study in the mid-90s where he gave intravenous DMT to a variety of patients and documented kind of their response. And a lot that we've seen in the psychedelic community, in the psychedelic renaissance is the similarities between Eastern Zen, Buddhist, those types of New Age religions that are resonant with the psychedelic phenomenology, so to speak. But Rick Strassman, I believe he was a Buddhist. I don't know if he converted to Christianity, but we're going to look at this commentary that he made talking about prophecy, the Hebrew Bible, as it relates to the phenomenology of the DMT experience. I find it very, very fascinating. I think he supports a dialogue or a kind of more sober look of the Hebrew and Christian Bible in light of the phenomenology and the experiences that are reflected and represented in the psychedelic space. Now, I'm not as interested in this as I was before, but in thinking about kind of orthodox theology in relation and in dialogue with other domains and disciplines, I looked up Rick Strassman, and in this reading, he's going to go pretty deep into his understanding of how DMT beings kind of represent and reflect what is reported by Ezekiel in his vision. But it's really going to dial in on the prophetic nature of the Hebrew Bible and how this is the big differentiator between, the Eastern mystical traditions. And he's advocating for a more inclusive dialogue and for another look in the Western religious canon in light of the psychedelic phenomenological reports. So I don't agree with a lot that's said in here. I found it extremely fascinating, though, and what I found glaringly absent from Mr. Strassman's or Dr. Strassman's analysis is any understanding or engagement with Eastern Orthodoxy. And at the end, he kind of supports this. It seems like he's got a big lacunae that's missing, and I would find it interesting if somebody had the inclination to do so, to really put these domains in dialogue as well. So we're going to start here. Again, this is Rick Strassman. Go ahead and look him up. He's been on Joe Rogan. He's a couple times, I think. He wrote the book The Spirit Molecule, where he outlined a lot of the feedback that he got from the patients that he did these experiments on. I find it endlessly fascinating. But almost maybe too fascinating. But I think there's a lot to mine there. So as you listen to some of this stuff here, take what you like, take what works for you, and leave the rest. And I find you'll find it, if anything, entertaining, fascinating, and something to maybe distract you a bit from the political and the cultural. So I hope you guys like it. This will require a non-trivial degree of open-mindedness on your part. So please put on your open-minded caps. There's a natural aversion to the Hebrew Bible carried by most in secular education, Westerners. Nevertheless, one of the supposed hallmarks of being duly psychedelicized is being open-minded. Therefore, try to take off your anti-Bible, anti-God, and anti-Israel caps, at least for a while, in order to allow as much of this information as possible to at least register. The Hebrew Bible is a collection of 22 books written mostly in biblical Hebrew. It's not Kabbalah, which is a centuries later development that owes its existence to Christian and Eastern thought making its way into Judaism. The Hebrew Bible is the foundational religious text for the half of the planet's population. It influences all civilizations, economics, theology, architecture, aesthetics, politics, sociology, anthropology, medicine, ritual, morality, and ethics. It's clearly powerful, and its power exerts influence wherever we turn. It's been in circulation for at least 2,500 years, and there's no reason why it should be closed to or spurned by the psychedelic community. It's not reasonable that only certain people, many of whom are unscrupulous in their use of its power, have access to the text. There are many resistances to reading the text, emotional and intellectual. Concepts like God, reward and punishment, commandments, creation, Israel, and so on can make it seem incomprehensible. This is why we need commentaries, the most useful of which were written by a number of authors between the turn of the Common Era and the 13th century. There are other ways to break down those resistances. You can read the text out loud, which is especially effective if done in Hebrew. Nevertheless, there are good English translations that, if read out loud, are also quite powerful in establishing resonance between you and the text. Intense study leads to an altered state, which resonates with the state of which the text emerged, the prophetic state. Here the commentators are the sitters, supportively explaining to you what it is you're reading and providing a comforting presence while you're floundering in the text. The paradigmatic spiritual experience in the Hebrew Bible is prophecy. I define this as any spiritual experience occurring in any figure described in the text. It doesn't necessarily have to be canonical prophet like Isaiah, and it is any spiritual experience, not only those that include foretelling or prediction. The association between foretelling and prophecy is an artifact of the Greek translation of the Hebrew word for prophet, navi, which the Greeks translated to as prophets, prophetis, one who speaks before something happens. The Greeks were interested in the divinatory properties of religious experience and their utility in predicting or divining. However, navi, the Hebrew word for prophet, means, quote, an interpreter or translator, a spokesperson. The Hebrew Bible is an account of prophetic experience, composed and edited by those in a prophetic state. Thus, it's a prophetic text. That, I believe, is the source of the power of the Bible. It's similar to when you read the Buddhist sutras. The sutras are verbal descriptions of an enlightened state, and reading them is quite compelling. In the case of the Hebrew Bible, it's a prophetic text, a verbal description of prophetic experience, which is equally compelling in its own way. Let's look at the book of Ezekiel, chapter 1. In Ezekiel's initial theophany, the heavens opened. He saw visions of God. There was a stormy wind, a great cloud, flashing fire, brilliance surrounding it, lightning, and semblance of beings emerged from the midst of the fire. There are spheres, wheels. Ezekiel sees faces of beings, a man, a lion, ox, and eagle. The beings run rapidly to and fro despite the immobility of their legs. The beings' backs and wings are full of eyes. Some beings fly through space, controlled by other beings. The sound of wings is like a great rushing waters. There's an expanse of blue or rainbow over the beings' heads. Ezekiel is overwhelmed, lost all strength, and falls on his face. An angel stands him up, speaks to him, pulls him by the hair, and carries him through space. This complex vision of Ezekiel is called by the rabbis the chariot. This is an example of what I call, quote, the equivalence of imagery. One uses the available repertoire of mental imagery, the imaginative constituents, to garb or clothe the information contained in the visions. I may have looked like a chariot to Ezekiel, but it may look like a lab or a UFO or a futuristic landscape to modern secularists. However, equivalence of imagery suggests that the same information is contained in the different images and could be extracted with proper interpretive keys. Struck by similarities between descriptions by my volunteers of the DMT state and the reports of prophetic experience in the Hebrew Bible, I began to comparing the two syndromes' phenomenology. If there was significant similarity, it would be legitimate to consider DMT as mediating prophetic phenomenology. My default mode of this comparison was the Buddhist Adidharma psychological model of the skandhas. This is the system I'd used to develop the rating scale for quantifying the DMT experience. These are the familiar concepts: form, feeling, perception, consciousness, understanding, and habitual tendencies. I morphed these into more traditional mental status and psychiatric terminology. Once I began this comparison of the two states, I found that the overlap was striking. One of the areas of less than perfect overlap between the DMT and prophetic states hinges on the issue of the spoken voice versus the telepathic voice. If we assume that most of what prophetic figures hear in the text is telepathic rather than an outside voice, then this problem disappears. If we were looking for a spoken voice, then we would probably need to look at other endogenous compounds that elicit this phenomena, such as the anticholinergic compounds. While the degree of overlap was impressive, it seemed as if there was something missing in my categories, in that something was going on in the prophetic state that wasn't as well developed in the DMT one. This turned out to be the category I termed, quote, relatedness, the nature of the interactions between the beings and those perceiving them. The interactions are primarily verbal, but also work through other modalities such as the body, emotions, visual imagery, and sound. Primary function of relating was to communicate information. There are a number of gradations in the level of intimacy in the relationship. One can be minimally engaged and just observe what's going on, or one can be minimally observed by the beings. One can overhear conversations among other beings. These examples occur both in the prophetic and the DMT experiences. Then there is a more direct communication taking place between a being spoken to by a being or speaking to a being. There can be two-way conversation, or there can be multiple parties involved in almost a group conversation. One of the advantages attending to a verbal model, as exemplified by the Hebrew Bible prophetic one, is the ability to engage in enhanced interactions with the beings. One possesses words with which to communicate with the beings and each other afterwards, in a way that may only be hinted at or alluded in the perceptual and emotional components of the psychedelic experience. For example, there is ineffable and then there is ineffable. There are varying degrees of ineffability. If we can approximate the experience 98% but not 100%, we are much further ahead than 0%, throwing up our hands in despair and saying there are just no words for it. The verbal currency also engages our intellect with the information contained in the state, and that intellectual engagement may be fruitfully pursued by studying the prophetic text. We can think about it and exercise our intellects in attempting to understand and to integrate and communicate it, rather than simply attempting to remember and evoke inarticulate feelings and perceptions. There is much more verbal information in the Hebrew Bible's characterization of the content of the prophetic experience than in the DMT state. But when the two do address the same issues, there is relatively good overlap, such as the existence and nature of the one God and the golden rule. There are also differences. In the DMT state, there were cases of volunteers helping, healing, guiding, or benefiting the beings. For example, someone transferred emotional energy and love to the beings who lacked them. Another volunteer found that she had to be careful how much she focused on the beings or how she asked questions because they would shy away. In general, the level of interaction and the depth and breadth of the data or information contained in the prophetic literature is significantly greater than that which most people bring back from the DMT experience. This leads one to consider whether the text of the Hebrew Bible, which is a spiritual text describing a DMT-like world, might help us extract information from the DMT state. And if you start looking at the prophetic message, this focuses primarily on the nature of reality, both spiritual and material, and how to relate to it to a higher possible manner, the least harm and the most good. These are the key concerns to many of us who value the psychedelic state for its long-term social and individual boons. So we have, quote, prophecy meets the DMT state. They're both interactive, relational, rather than mystical, unitive. They both are experienced and believed to be more real than everyday reality. They are full of beings, and the prophetic text is accompanied by highly complex and far-reaching verbal descriptions of the message of the experience. As a result of my Hebrew Bible research, I developed a new model, a top-down theo-neurological model. It brings God into the discussion and lays out a higher level of abstraction regarding why things are the way they are. It also may be useful in extracting more meaning from our psychedelic experiences. For example, neurotheology's answer as to why humans are constructed to have spiritual experiences is because of their evolutionary advantages, because of their evolutionarily advantageous effect. In contrast, theo-neurology answers because this provides a means for God to communicate with us. It integrates theological plus materialistic models, hopefully combining the best rigor and wisdom of both. It's based on a contemporary treatment of medieval metaphysics developed by the Jewish philosophers. In particular, I'm indebted to Maimonides, who lived in Egypt around the 1200s. If one there If one were to name his metaphysics, it would be called Neoplatonic Aristotelianism. The medievalists basically suggest, and I use the word basically tongue-in-cheek because it took me years to distill what Maimonides and his heirs proposed, that there is a process of divine overflow or emanation from an incorporeal and categorically incomprehensible God. This God created and sustains cause and effect, the wheels that drive natural law and moral law. This God existed before and will exist after cause and effect. Emanation, or divine efflux or overflow, is carried by by what are called separate intelligences by Aristotle, and by the Jewish philosophers, intermediaries or angels. Intermediaries may be the most easily accepted term. These intermediaries regulate the spheres, field-like repositories of energy and information through which godly influence is exerted. The nature of this energy and information becomes increasingly coarse as one descends through them. These intermediaries are semi-corporeal or quasi-material, as Edie Fresca mentioned yesterday. The last and coarsest sphere is the sublunar, in which exists the earthly realm. The first of the intermediaries is sometimes called Metatron, or the first angel. However, I think this could also be conceived of as the Big Bang. It's the first manifestation of something that can, and at least, begin to comprehend, rather than something God that existed before the Big Bang, which, due to the absence of time and space, was known them as incomprehensible. The prophetic state devolves from divine overflow through spheres, regulating by the intermediaries onto one's equally and highly developed imaginative and rational faculties. The rational faculty extracts meaning from the divinely derived contents displayed in the imagination. By imaginative faculty, I don't mean imaginary as in made up, but rather the arena of the mind that contains the phenomenology, feelings, perceptions, and so on. Then the intellect extracts the meaning from those imaginative contents. Those imaginative contents may be verbal, but they still require the intellect to decipher, extract meaning, and interpret them. It's interesting to note that the highest grade of prophecy was allegedly attained by Moses. Except for his initial epiphany or theophany at the burning bush, Moses experienced his prophetic communications nearly entirely verbally. He had almost no visions after the burning bush. In others, prophetic experiences detailed in the Hebrew Bible occurring in non-Mosaic figures, there's always a measure of visionary experience. Where does the information contained in the prophetic experience come from? Is it contained in the overflow? Or is it contained within us and the overflow only strengthens our capacities to access it? In either case, the information itself or the new ability to perceive the information comes from an outside source. Theo-neurology suggests that God created the brain in such a manner as to be able to communicate with us. This is in contrast to the neurotheology model. Oh, I think I missed my space here. This is in contrast to the neurotheology model, which suggests that the brain creates the impression of God communicating with us. In contrast, I propose that elevated activity of endogenous DMT may mediate the DMT-like features of the prophetic experience. I'm suggesting endogenous rather than exogenous DMT because there is no textual evidence for the mind-altering use of plants other than grape wine in the Hebrew Bible. Even if one were to agree with Benny Shannon's thesis that Moses' burning bush was a DMT-emitting Akaya, that this was one isolated incident. It does nothing to explain 99.99% of other visionaries or prophetics states in the text. How does one go about experiencing prophecy? First, it is necessary to be qualified, an idea I will tie to my later discussion of an enlarged definition of psychedelic. Being, quote-unquote, qualified means that one is capable of understanding what is apprehended in the prophetic state. The intellect can be trained through study. The medievalists recommended the classical disciplines, art, the science, grammar, music, and scripture, and learning and practicing ethical behavior keep the emotional mind free of degrading influences. With respect to the imagination, its function may be enhanced via psychedelics. There are techniques that may theoretically enhance the activity of endogenous DMT, techniques that occasion DMT-like experience, such as fasting, prayer, sleep deprivation, and so on. These provide a richer soil for the planting of visionary experience. When one possesses equally and highly developed imaginative and intellectual faculties, then one is quote-unquote qualified. However, the ultimate arbiter for the attainment of prophecy is God. This caveat makes it impossible to force the issue. For example, one may be qualified, but God will determine that the place, time, need, and community receptivity are suitable to bestow prophecy. There's also the notion that God may make one qualified miraculously in order to communicate at a particular time and place in the absence of anyone already qualified. We thus see that being qualified and God having the final decision are dynamic concepts that interact with each other. This prophecy still exists. The rabbis declared an end to prophecy around the time of the Common Era. It's hard to imagine a biological mechanism despite Julian Jaynes' theories of structural or functional changes in the brain in response to particular social and climatic pressures. The rabbi's spiritual explanation, the miracle of withholding prophecy from qualified individuals, quickly gets convoluted. I think the more salient explanation is political. The Romans occupying Judea were intolerant of any politically disruptive individuals, which is by definition the role of a canonical prophet. In addition, Christianity was just beginning, so there was a rabbinic need to close off the prophetic canon and thus the prophetic lineage, denying prophetic status to Jesus and his followers. Despite the official declaration, if you look carefully at the Judaic stream since that time, the prophetic experience never really disappeared. Rather, it was marginalized and made more esoteric, for example, in Kabbalah and Hasidism. What is the prophetic message? Simply put, it is ethical monotheism. There is one God who revealed through prophecy the golden rule: love your fellow as yourself. The goal is world peace, not individual enlightenment or happiness. In this way, it significantly differs from the Eastern model. Even though these two basic tenets of prophetic message, one God and the golden rule, are relatively simple, at least verbally, they extend into every aspect of reality: social psychology, how to wage war, economics, the nature of the family, inheritances, and agriculture. In the latter sense, the sabbatical law instructs us to let fields lie fallow every 7 years. Interestingly, there are no technological themes such as how to build interstellar spacecraft or generate unlimited energy. The Hebrew Bible also teaches by narrative and law the existence of nature of cause and effect. That is, if you don't follow the revealed guidelines for behavior and belief leading to social and individual health, there are consequences. For example, the ecological devastation that we are now seeing may be analogized to the, quote, land vomiting out its inhabitants, described as the consequences of not following the golden rule and devotion to the belief in one God. In fact, one of the reasons the Hebrews were exiled from their land was because of their not following the law of the sabbatical. There's a very interesting notion in the Hebrew Bible of the, quote, world to come. If you look carefully at it, the world to come appears to be an incorporeal world with DMT-like features. And since I like coming up with wide-ranging, barely believable ideas that nevertheless are at least potentially empirically testable, it's fascinating to speculate about a biological mechanism ushering in the world to come. Perhaps it represents or is the end result of the simultaneous activation of the genetic apparatus for DMT synthesis in all organisms possessing it. This would be a, quote, biology of the rapture. What would be the trigger, the stimulus for the simultaneous widespread DMT event? One possibility is exogenous, some kind of celestial event such as a massive gamma burst, or something endogenous, a genetic clock that is ticking in all of us, or our own genetic engineering, say, of a highly contagious virus containing the promoter of a transcription of the DMT synthesizing gene. Relevant to the, quote, end of days, there's a phrase in Isaiah where God describes the onset of the world to come. Quote, in its time, I will hasten it. In other words, it will occur sooner or later, either from an external or internal stimulus. One of the implications of the theo-neurological model is that the Hebrew Bible may inform our thinking about the psychedelic state and its integration into our own larger world. For example, we might be able to learn how to interact more effectively with the beings by seeing how prophetic figures in the text did so. There's an episode in Joshua's career where he confronted by an angelic being holding a sword. He doesn't know if it's a good or a bad being. He simply asks, are you with us or against us? We also can apply biblical concepts, vocabulary, and narratives to the psychedelic state. Are we seeing one aspect or another of God? By entering into the psychedelic state with enhanced cognitive tools, we may be able to, for example, tailor our prayers using some of the blueprints laid out in the text. We would then be more ideally situated to pray in the most appropriate manner, petitioning, praising, or thanksgiving. We can We claim Western spirituality using the imaginative effects of psychedelics combined with the cognitive scaffolding of the Hebrew Bible. For example, the Zendo project helps those at music festivals suffering from adverse effects of psychedelic drugs. A Zendo is a Zen meditation hall. But what does a Zendo have to do with psychedelics? Well, everything, if you look inside a contemporary head shop. Buddha's incest, Tibetan bells, dorjes, and tangas. One benefits from being contemplative and attentive, but why can't this resource be called the Tabernacle Project or the Temple Project? We are mindlessly appropriating an Eastern model for the psychedelic drug state without knowing very much about the nature of the benefits of the Western one. It is an unthinking and uncritical, because of the resonance with our own Western spirituality, which may even extend down to the biological level, for example, relative abundance or sensitivity to DMT versus 5-methoxy-DMT and the different effects occasioned by each, we benefit more from using models that partake of Western spirituality than those that partake of New Age, shamanic, or Eastern models. This adoption of an Eastern unitive mystical paradigm is an even thornier and thus studiously avoided issue in the research community. Research projects that, taken as a given in the universe, unitive mystical state is the goal of psychedelic experiences in both therapeutic and clinical spirituality projects. It is placed in front of volunteers, established as the goal, and drug sessions are steered in that direction. Correlations are made between the unitive mystical state and the desired outcomes. This is a trend beginning with Vivekananda's Odyssey to the United States in the 1800s, late 1800s. And we have yet to shine the light of day on it. Have we really determined that the Eastern unitive mystical state is better, more to be sought after, helpful, or therapeutic than the interactive relational one? Psychiatric researchers with minimal familiarity with religious studies claim that all religions value the mystical state. However, there's nothing in the Hebrew Bible pointing towards this. There's no example of the mystical unitive state in the entire text. The problem for the research community, however, is how to incorporate the well-defined cognitive correlates of the prophetic experience, something that is much more difficult to do in the all is one, no self, no thought aspect of the Eastern model. But I believe it can be done, first by characterizing the nature of the interactive relational state with the same rigor that has been applied to the unitive mystical one. Returning to the beings for cause for this meaning. The beings may be purely subjective. They may represent our own psychology or, more precisely, the activity of our mind-brain complex. Their nature would be like that of a dream. At the most superficial layer of this model, they may represent residual feelings or thoughts that barely linger in the backs of our minds. At a deeper one, they might be symbolic representations of significant, previously unconscious emotional dynamics. For example, a healing being may represent a health care provider for whom we have strong feelings that we can't express. These psychological notions draw on the implicit assumptions of the term psychedelic, quote-unquote, mind manifesting. Our apprehension of the beings reflects or discloses the working of our mind. Looking at the beings as objective, we might understand them as residing in alternative levels of reality such as dark matter or parallel universes. Modified consciousnesses resulting from elevated brain levels of psychedelic compounds derived from either endogenous or exogenous sources allows us to peer directly into these realms and view their putative inhabitants. One approach to determine the objective nature of the beings would be to develop quantum cameras, or dark matter cameras that allow us to capture images of what exists in these alternate universes. By comparing those images and descriptions to descriptions of the DMT state, we would be able to determine their correspondence. If they do correspond, we can more confidently posit an external location of the phenomena. There's another way to look at the beings as objective, not necessarily as inhabitants of other planets or other planes of existence. They may be sensible representations of normally insensible processes or forces. For example, the beings appear to consist of light, but this may not be their true nature. Instead, light might be the only visible representation or manifestation of a particular process. This would be akin to how a flame visibly expresses the operation of combustion. Our perceptual apparatus, as it were, can only see what it is capable of seeing. What are the external forces that the beings may thus represent? They may include healing and illness, strength and weakness, love and hate, evil and good, wisdom and folly. Using the medieval Jewish philosophers' metaphysics, these are God's intermediaries, the vehicles through which divine efflux or emanation influences the universe, how providence is affected in the world. For example, apprehension of the activity of the angel Raphael may represent the local action of universal healing forces, and Gabriel those of strength. These world-affecting forces manifest in comprehensible visual, somatic, and other modalities using the repertoire of our minds possess. This model of the beings adds an additional level of sophistication to a discussion of the objective, externally existent nature of them. That is, they may not be inhabitants of other levels of reality, but rather omnipresent forces that exist external to ourselves. These forces can observe by means of our subjective consciousness. If this is the case, then our invisible world's camera, rather than capturing images of localized objects, may be capturing images of more pervasive types of forces exerting local effects. On the other hand, our hypothetical instruments might be able to capture any images of these external objects or external forces, whether discrete, localized, or local representations of omnipresent forces. This might be the case if perceiving them requires an interaction between them and our minds. In the case of a local manifestation of omnipresent forces, we might theorize that lifeless machines, those without a divinely placed soul, cannot apprehend divine influence. It might simply be too subtle to be objectively recorded. It requires interaction with a subjectively experienced mind. This provides a stimulus to expand in the field of the term psychedelic, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. The term may now be invoked to include how our minds apprehend external forces that are not being generated from within. That is, psychedelic substances may affect how we perceive external objects or forces, as well as how those external objects or forces manifest in our minds. We apprehend the beings in a more or less clear manner depending on the degree of overlay from our own psychology, biology, training, and education. If all of these variables are operating optimally, we apprehend in as an unadulterated a manner as possible those external things. The less well-developed those faculties, the more we muddy our observations with our own internal workings, wishes, hopes, conflicts, and so on. This muddying results in our subjective experience of objective things being more of a mirror less than a window. It's never too early to begin thinking about the implications of establishing the reality of the DMT beings. For example, how best to introduce these findings to the public? How will they gauge the value of what is being shared with us? Here we enter the discussion of the true versus false prophecy. To paraphrase Joshua, how can we determine if they are for us or against us? Will we attempt to weaponize them, or will they attempt to weaponize us? Who has access to the beings and for what purposes? There's a host of incalculably complex and ramifying political, religious, ethical, and other issues. Thanks for listening.